So it is my great pleasure to welcome Mr. De Geus, and I'd like to invite you to speak.
Alan, thank you for these kind words of introduction. And indeed, it's my pleasure to come over to Melbourne, to the ANZSOG, to share with you some thoughts about making reform happen, also to learn from you. A lot of reform efforts here in this part of the world can bring lessons to Europe or to other members of the OECD. This is our raison d'être. In OECD, we try to learn from each other in terms of best practices based on research and analysis, but then the knowledge firm is our game. We have no binding authority. We do not prescribe rules. We do not have funds in OECD. But we have 34 members in Europe, United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Israel, and more coming. And these countries exchange their experiences in terms of best practices. So here we can learn from each other. We also work closely together with the emerging economies because as an economic organization, you have no future if you don't work together with countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. So we do also that. We do that in a so-called matrix approach. We have a country approach in which we make economic reviews on what happens in countries and give recommendations every 18 months. In that context, we've done Australia in December 2008, and the new publication for Australia is upcoming. We politely wait until the moment that you have a new government. But in 2008, we recommended things like raising public investment in infrastructure and education, strengthening labor supply by further cuts in marginal taxes for secondary earners, families with children and single parents, improving the performance of the education system, continuing the reform of product markets and industrial relations in sectors such as energy, freight, and water management. Well, this is the past. Well, these are the recommendations of 2008, and we will see what we can recommend in the 2010. We also do thematic reviews, where we have an item like pensions or like taxes, and then we have the thematic reviews. This is cross-country. And then sometimes we go from that thematic point, we go back to the country. So in that context, we did for Australia the review on regulatory reform, recently published in 2010. I think, yeah, it's 2010. And here we praise your regulatory reforms in the last years, but we also see some challenges. For example, to involve business more in your regulatory reform so that they can be a partner in reform rather than an opponent. Okay. Examples not to be discussed in detail here, but one can imagine. And then we do other horizontal work. And in that horizontal work, one of the projects is making reform happen. And this is not about the content itself of the reforms, but it is about questions how to design reforms in terms that they can be decided successfully, how to design reforms in the terms that they can be implemented successfully, and that they can sustain, that they can stick. So, when the invitation came to speak to you about this matter, I was extremely excited to do that, and it coincided more or less with the moment on which we produced this book, Making Reform Happen, and Alan was so kind to recommend it to you, so I don't have to do that. and we will have an international conference on this theme in Paris in November, and we will do further work on it as well. In my contribution for today, I would like to start with a general picture of where we are in the global agenda, in the global economic agenda. This will tell us something about the case for structural reforms. Then we go into some areas of structural reform, and by doing that, we also will speak about some of these making reform happen challenges, how to do the reforms in terms that they can be done successfully. That is based not only on my personal experience in the Netherlands, but mainly on the experience that we have in OECD in the different areas where reforms are executed. You have to think there not only about the staff that we have in Paris or the consultants we work with, but mainly the experts of all these countries, some of you sitting here in the room, who contribute to our collective knowledge. The first slide shows in an overview where we are at the moment. We are at the moment that we try to reconcile growth on the one hand and fiscal consolidation on the other hand. We see that the recovery of the global economy is ongoing. We see that that dance is led by the emerging market economies. We see that the Asian markets in the emerging markets are the fastest growing, and they accelerate also world trade. But we see, on the other hand, that in many OECD countries, the fiscal consolidation is a serious issue, and that we still grapple with huge unemployment. This is a slide on which you can see that the annualized growth in percentages in the United States has recovered from the recession in 2008-09 to a growth rate of, firstly, more or less 5%, but now more or less stable at 3 to 4%, and that is what we expect it to be in the next years. Of course, this peak in the second half of 2009 was also due to the huge stimulus package in the United States. In Japan, we saw an even deeper recession, but we see now a rather stable recovery of the economy. And in the euro area, we also saw the recession, and we see only a very modest recovery due to factors where I will speak about in a minute. In this context, I do not have a singled out graph for Australia, but you know that your growth rate here is more or less, I think, 3%? Yeah. And, by the way, you did not have the recession that much, but that is also due to factors that you are very closely related to the economies of the emerging markets. Here we see the emerging economies in terms of production. So this is not the growth rate, this is the production rate. And it's very interesting to see that countries like China and India did not go below zero in terms of industrial production. So their industrial production continued, and this is of course also one of the reasons that you could continue your export to countries like China because the demand there did not fall too low. You see also here that a country like Brazil suffered a lot from the dip in the economy of the United States, but they recovered very well and are now, in industrial production terms, one of the fast growers. And we see here also that overall in OECD, industrial production now has recovered from its dip in 2008-09. We see that this industrial production, maybe to go back just a little bit, that this industrial production firstly took up in very buoyant terms, now slows a little bit down, and that is what we expect, that the The first reaction was more or less to catch up with what was not done in 08, 09, but now it will be maybe slowed down a little bit, but the growth rates remain strong. We see in 2010 that China is at 10%, India 8%, Indonesia 6%, Brazil 5%, Russia is an interesting country because it depends for its economy a lot on its energy sector. And in 09, when they had a recession of minus 8%, they are now back to a growth rate of 5%. We see that China and Brazil already started to withdraw policy stimulus, so their growth will slow down a little bit, but that is, can only be done because the growth is so solid that they can withdraw their stimulus package, and others have to follow that example. We saw that this solid growth also supports the expansion of global trade. And that is, of course, very important for the complete OECD area, your country among them. And this global trade picked up just in one quarter. The last on which we have a concrete number was Q1, compared to Q4 in 09, plus 5%. The baseline for the GDP growth, as we foresee it in our economic outlook of May 2010, is that we see until 2025 yearly growth rates in the US, EU, and Japan, more or less modest, 1 to 3%, but China, Indonesia, and India will grow at a much faster pace, and Australia will benefit from that with a relatively good growth rates in the next, let's say, 10, 15 years. Now, going to Europe, you see, and this is a question that I often get when not in Europe, but outside Europe, man, where is Europe going? What are you doing over there with all your financial markets? Are you going bankrupt? What's Greece about? And then, well, yesterday I heard from my driver that there is a huge Greek community here in Melbourne. He spoke about 700,000, so I'm curious to see them on the streets. But, well, anyway, this Greek community might be concerned about their heritage in Greece or the other way around. But anyway, you see that there is a serious concern about Greece. The difference between the Greek sovereign bonds with respect to the German, which is more or less the standard in Europe, is growing up to about 8%, and that is still growing. In the last months, you see May, June, and July, you see much higher figures than in 07 and 09. So this is a serious concern. You've read about it in the newspapers. You see that Portugal and Ireland are also of some concern. Spain and Italy are in the newspapers, but one cannot say that a difference of maybe 2% to the German spreads is a reason to panic for Spain or Italy. So from that slide, one can see that there is a need for fiscal consolidation, and this is related to the facts that all these countries have huge deficit, and all these countries have a very high public debt. In Australia, you have a deficit of around, I think now, more or less 5%. Oh, no, 3%, 3 to 5, yeah, more or less. But in the US and in the European Union,